Hey, welcome. So I'm so sorry. The Zoom wasn't working on Thursday. I want to apologize for that. I also want to apologize for the fact that this video came pretty late. It should have been done earlier, but I've been so caught up with committee meetings and lots of meetings and just been busy with stuff. But hey, that's no excuse. But the most important thing is that we got the video going, and at least I'm pretty excited to share this sort of concept with you in terms of the minimum wage. Okay, so that's what we did on Thursday. Basically, we looked at the minimum wage. Now, all of you have done some job where you were basically paid a minimum wage. So you sort of have an idea of it. But one of the most contentious, right, and sort of controversial debates in politics and in economics right now is the fact that should a minimum wage, which is basically 725, right, and it's been 725 since 2009, should it actually be increased to $15 an hour, right? Now, you can actually make a whole lot of arguments for it, and at the same time, you can make compelling arguments against it, okay? So one major argument for it is that, well, most of the people actually earn minimum wage tend to be low-income people. So increasing their wages, right, should actually help them in terms of improve their standards of living and also bridge the income inequality gap, okay? So we have the gap of low-income people and the rich people. And at least increasing the minimum wage will actually try and reduce this gap, okay? So we have the low people here, right? But then again, at the same time, if you're looking at things from the perspective of an employer, right? So for example, McDonald's, right? Increasing the minimum wage means that labor costs are basically going to increase as well. Now, if labor costs increase, are you going to hire more people or less people, okay? So the arguments could be made about the fact that increasing the minimum wage, yes, will help these low income people, but at the same time might probably lead to unemployment, okay? Now, what is the economic implications behind it? Well, it's more complicated than you think, but in this chapter, and essentially in this level, or at this level, we'll basically look at things in a really simplified version. Now, again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email, or don't hesitate to ask me in class as well. Okay, now let's move forward. So we basically have to look at things we call a price floor first and foremost. Okay, so what is a price floor? Well, a price floor simply is any regulation that makes it illegal, according to the government, to trade at a price which is lower than a specified level. Okay, so a price floor is basically the lowest legal price that can be paid for a good or for labor. And this is quite interesting. We've been hearing about the argument for raising the minimum wage, and rightly so. Okay, but well, if we actually have a price floor, right, what are the possible implications behind that? Okay, so it's illegal to trade basically at a lower level. Suppose you basically have a good that is selling for, let's say, $4. Well, it means that you can't really buy this good if there's a price floor, right, of $3. You can't buy this good for, let's say, $2. Or you can't sell the good for basically $2. Neither can you sell the good for $2.99 as well, okay? So that's the whole idea of a price floor. Now, a price floor is basically a government action. And right now, we're looking at government actions in markets, okay? Now, if a price floor is basically sort of given out to the labor market, so as applied to the job market, is basically a minimum wage, right? So a price floor applied to labor markets is a minimum wage. Now think about it. Well, we have the minimum wage of $7.25 in Iowa. Well, technically it's illegal to basically go or pay anyone below $7.25, right? So that is a price floor. Below which you can't basically sell labor, which is basically offering your labor services. At the same time, below it, you can't basically buy labor, right? So it's illegal to basically pay anyone, let's say, $6. Okay, everyone should be paid at $7.25, and rightly so. Okay, you sort of understand. It's basically there to protect the workers, so the workers don't get underpaid. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about a minimum wage is that there are a couple of economic implications about it, and we can actually take a look at it. Now, when we have a labor market, we always have the issue of equilibrium. So every time you think of a market, think that there's at some point going to be equilibrium in a market where demand basically equals supply. Now, if the minimum wage is set below the equilibrium wage rate, it basically has no effect. This is rule number 1, you should remember. Okay, if the minimum wage is set below the equilibrium wage rate, it has no effect. Why? Now think about it. If everyone in the market agrees the wage to be $10, okay, so firms agree the wage should be $10, okay, employees agree the wage should be $10, and the government comes in and says, hey, well, you shouldn't go below, let's say, $8. So the minimum wage is $8. You shouldn't go below $8. Well, nobody really cares anyway, because in that market, everybody has agreed that the wage should basically be $10. So nobody really cares if the minimum wage is $8. Well, it's not illegal to charge $10, so nobody really cares. So it has no effect. Everybody would just go at the prevailing equilibrium wage rate. Okay? Now, the minimum wage basically has an effect only if it's applied to a labor market, which is basically at equilibrium and the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium wage rate, okay? Then it has effects. Now, if the labor market is basically has equilibrium at $10 and you set the minimum wage at $12, now you have a problem here. Everybody agrees that the wage should be $10, okay? That's the agreed upon wage. But now you're making this $10 basically illegal because it's basically below the $12 minimum wage, okay? So then that has effects, okay? And then we're going to be looking at the effects it basically has, so the economic or the microeconomic implications it basically has. Now, one thing you should know is that at least at this level, the minimum wage always is going to lead to unemployment, okay? Now, why does it bring unemployment? Well, it's because it's set above the equilibrium wage. Every time price of something is set above equilibrium wage, you actually have the problem of quantity supplied being more than quantity demanded. Now, let's look at this in the labor market. In the labor market, quantity of labor supplied is essentially by workers. I supply my labor to Wartburg. People who actually work at McDonald's supply their labor to McDonald's, okay? People who actually work at Applebee's supply their labor to Applebee's, okay? Now, in a labor market, the workers are the ones who supply labor. They sell their labor. I'm selling my labor services and my labor time basically to Wartburg, right? To go teach, okay? And who demands labor? Who consumes labor? I know it sounds really weird, but the people who actually consume labor and demand labor tend to be employers. Employers demand labor. They want labor to come work for them, okay? Right, now, every time you have price above equilibrium price, it always creates a surplus. That's something you should remember. Okay, it's always going to create a surplus. Right? So, in that sense, there's a surplus of labor. Okay, in that sense, there's a surplus of labor. Now, a fancy way for saying surplus of labor essentially is unemployment. If you have labor basically out there not doing anything, well, that labor is basically unemployed, okay? So we just say it's unemployment, okay? So the minimum wage always leads to unemployment, at least in the short run, okay? Now, at this point, if you don't understand something, I'll suggest that maybe you should pause the video, just breathe through stuff again and see if you can get a better meaning or a clearer meaning into it. And again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Now, let's use diagrams to basically sort of look at this and illustrate this point, okay? Now, we have this labor market, and again, in the labor market, right, we have price of labor, and price of labor is basically the wage rate. And we have quantity of labor, which is basically the amount of workers in this market, okay? So at this point, we have equilibrium, which is point A, the point where demand equals supply, okay, are basically equal, right? And at this point, we have our wage rate being 9, okay? And the amount of labor being employed being 21. So wage rate is 9, amount of labor being employed is 21. Well, people in the labor market basically lobby and say, hey, you know what? $9 is too low. Yeah, it is the equilibrium wage, but it is really too low. So they lobby and they go to government, and government decides to raise the minimum wage to $10. Okay, so in our market, the minimum wage is basically set to $10 an hour. Okay, Now note this $10 an hour is set above the equilibrium wage rate. So the equilibrium wage rate was basically 9. Now you actually have $10 here being set above the equilibrium wage rate. Okay. Now you're going to have a new point. Okay, you have this point A, and also you have this point B, which is touching the supply curve. So A is touching the demand curve and B is touching the supply curve. Now you can clearly see that as the minimum wage increased, well, quantity demand of labor basically has decreased. Okay, so we're moving up along the demand curve. At the same time, as wage has increased, quantity of labor supplied, people are willing to work more hours, or people are willing to work more, right? Because wages have increased. Yes, $10 now. Now I want to work. Okay, I'm induced by the money. I'm incentivized by the money, right? At the same time, what the minimum wage creates is the fact of the illegal region. Okay, now the illegal region is basically any region below the minimum wage rate. And essentially, sadly, our equilibrium wage rate falls over there. Okay, so now in this case, the quantity of labor employed due to the minimum wage, right? Employers are sort of not willing to hire a lot of people, is going to be 20. Okay, so quantity of labor employed is basically going to be where the minimum wage touches the demand curve, which in this case is essentially 20. Right? But what you notice is that essentially the quantity of labor supplied exceeds the quantity of labor demanded. Okay, because the minimum wage has increased, now there are more people in the workforce looking for jobs. Yeah, because higher wages, they want to earn more, they want to increase their standard of living, they want to consume more. So now you have 20 people looking for jobs, but there are only 20 jobs basically available. Right? So this basically creates unemployment. Okay, so this essentially is going to create an unemployment level, right? And how does it create unemployment? Where there are 22 people looking for jobs, there are only 20 people being hired. So then it's going to be unemployment of 2. So 22 minus 20, and the unemployment is 2. Okay, so the unemployment is always going to be the gap between quantity of labor demanded and quantity of labor supplied. Okay, but what the minimum wage also creates is sort of this illegal market, okay, where you have some people, right, because the minimum wage has caused unemployment, you have some people who are willing to sort of work for even $8, which was actually worse, right, because the initial equilibrium was only $9. Okay, so you have some people who probably illegally will want to work for $8 because they're desperate. Okay, they're desperate, right? So that's what the minimum wage also creates. Okay. Now, one more thing is that the minimum wage also creates an inefficiency in the market. Okay, and remember inefficiency. Every time production or every time quantity is below equilibrium quantity or is above equilibrium quantity, it creates an inefficiency in the market. Okay, every time quantity is below equilibrium quantity and above equilibrium quantity, it basically creates an inefficiency in the market. Okay, now the minimum wage basically leads to an inefficient outcome. Now let's go back to this. Remember, our efficient outcome prior to the minimum wage, or efficient quantity prior to the minimum wage, was 21. Now the minimum wage comes in and basically there's underproduction or under quantity. Think of it that way. I don't want to say production because saying production with labor sounds weird. But there's less quantity. Now, quantity of labor employed is less than the efficient quantity. Okay, quantity of labor employed is less than the efficient quantity. And basically it creates an inefficient outcome. Right, and that's what economists basically hate, right? We hate inefficient outcomes in any economy. Now, how does the inefficient outcome basically look like? Well, if the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium wage rate, okay, it creates a dead weight loss because this is the inefficient outcome. And remember dead weight loss from chapter 5. Okay, so we have this triangle A, B, and C. Okay, so triangle A, B, and C is basically our dead weight loss, right? How much the quantity basically deviates, or the loss in surplus due to the quantity deviating from its efficient quantity, in this case being 21. Okay, so we have a dead weight loss here. Now you should be able to find the area of this triangle. Okay, so how do you find the area of the triangle? So we're looking for triangle ABC, area of triangle ABC. Well, it's going to be half times 10 minus 8, because that's the base. So that is 2 times 1. And you should basically get 1. Okay, so that is the dead weight loss to society. Now notice that the minimum wage also decreases consumer surplus. Okay, so consumer surplus is always the area above the set price and below the demand curve. Now the consumer surplus in the labor market is known as the firm surplus because it's firms who actually consume labor. It's firms who actually demand labor. So we call it the firm surplus. Okay, initially the firm surplus was area or triangle A, B, because that's our equilibrium wage rate, C. But the minimum wage actually shrinks it. Okay, so now the firm surplus is now only A, D, and E. Okay, so now that is our firm surplus. And again, you can find the area of this triangle. I'd like you to work it. Pause this video and just solve it. Okay, so you have half times 2, okay, times 20, right? And you should be able to get 20. Okay, so that is the firm surplus. So the firm surplus in the labor market is basically synonymous with the consumer surplus. Now, we also have a dilemma here. We have what we call the producer surplus, okay? So the producer surplus is always the area below the price and above, right, the market and above the supply curve, okay? So now we have the producer surplus, which is the worker surplus, okay? Because it's workers who basically supply labor, right? So we have the worker surplus being over here, because this is amount that is only going to be employed. Okay, so you have this area over here, right? This triangle over here being your worker surplus, and again you can find the area of that triangle. Now, one thing the minimum wage also creates is basically what we call potential loss from job search. And essentially, the potential loss from job search, right, occurs. Why? Because essentially, when those two people are unemployed, remember in this market, you basically have two people unemployed, they use their productive resources in basically looking for a job, right? So resources that could have been used in actually making society more productive, or in basically providing more goods and services, right, is basically used in terms of looking for a job. Okay, so economists, that's not really productive. Okay, so that is also a loss in surplus, right? Well, the consumer doesn't benefit. I mean, the worker doesn't benefit because it's using his time to actually search for a job, whilst they could be using their time to actually make money. And producers also don't benefit. Firms also don't benefit. Why? Because firms could have hired that employee or worker to basically produce some good or service, and basically everybody loses. Okay, so this rectangle here, A, B, C, and D, is going to be the potential loss from job search. Right, so that's what we talked about on Thursday. I know it sounds pretty short, but obviously since we were in class, we had more discussions and questions and whatnot. But if you guys have more questions or any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. And yeah, I hope you actually enjoyed this video.